So first off, thank you for everyone for showed up. Basically, um, what I'll be kind of doing today is a book called "What the Best College Teachers Do." It has been incredibly helpful for me. I think it's a lot of common sense, but it's really nice to kind of read it explicitly and put into words. And I hope you find it useful as well. Um, so to start off, I just wanted to see if there are kind of some common qualities amongst all of us in terms of some of our kind of favorite qualities about teachers. So if we look, let's share my screen here. Here we go. So basically, this creates a word cloud, the smallest word cloud of all time. No, here it's getting a little bigger. There we go. Okay, so recognize. So in this, you will see, look at that. The bigger words have been mentioned more than the others. So things like students and recognized, you will see that those are mentioned more than once, most likely. So within this, we see students, rephrasing, recognized, philosophical, interest. Let's see what else. Nurtured, helped. So from a 30,000-foot view, it kind of seems that some aspect of being cared for and looked at as a human being seems to be coming up a bit. I'm just gonna make this space open if anyone wants to talk about it. If not, that's totally fine as well. Whatever you guys want to do. But if anyone wants to jump in and just talk about their experience, they're more than welcome to. But again, no pressure. And this will be the last time of speaking if you're shy. So don't feel.
Okay, this is Adrienne. I'm thinking about a particular professor that I observed. Actually, it was part of my early PFF experience. And it was a very difficult class in terms of the content. It dealt with race, gender, and representation. And, systemic, it dealt with media, institutional, and systemic racism and other isms and schisms in society.
Yeah.
But what I watched her do quite masterfully, I think, was help students, one, confront those issues and talk about them without being apologetic about the content, but allowing students to, she allowed space for them to really grasp the content and to express themselves using like theoretical vocabulary. It was literally letting them practice understanding the words, using the vocabulary. So for example, if a student started to express themselves and they did a lot of the stuff like saying, like, and those sort of weasel words that don't really mean anything, they're like fillers because you don't know what else to say. And she would stop the student and in a I guess you could say a nurturing way, help them find the words in the vocabulary, because there was also vocabulary as part of assignments, and an overall sheet that she handed out at the beginning of the semester, but to help them use the words that were appropriate for whatever, they were trying to say, to articulate, and would sometimes have them repeat themselves maybe 2 or 3 times in order to really be able to express themselves, so that by the end of the semester, they could actually sort of teach the class themselves. I guess, be in a position where they understood the material well enough to where they could articulate, their thoughts and the theory and other things that they'd learned in a learned, scholarly fashion. And in asking them to repeat themselves, it wasn't that they were it wasn't done in a way that a student would be embarrassed. It was more like coaching,
Right.
so that she would coach them along in order to just support their learning. I guess, it was a combination of scaffolding and then building on that. And it was just, I still kind of marvel at how she taught that class, because like I said, it was really difficult content. And for some students who were pretty much, I'd say, from privileged backgrounds, who really couldn't relate to some of the things, not all of them, but there were some things that they maybe couldn't really grasp or had never even had to deal with in a classroom situation, just new ideas and new perceptions, I'll put it that way, things that are presented from a whole different perspective. And in doing so, by the end of the class, they were able to do a project, present new information that they had themselves, done the research on, and present it to the class in a scholarly fashion. And I could see the learning myself from the first day with some students to the end of the semester, and
Right.
particularly with people who are shy to speak up. But that was the other thing. I know I'm talking a lot, but that was the other thing. She would also check to be sure that everybody at some point contributed something to the class. She didn't didn't overdo it and force people, but again, I guess it was just recognizing every person sitting in that room so that nobody was ignored or left out or marginalized.
Yeah, that sounds very impressive, especially for topics like that are not easy. And I think the thing you pointed out that hopefully we'll talk about a little is also, it sounded like students were very comfortable with being wrong, which is obviously part of the learning process, and to be expected in any classroom. So thank you for sharing, Adrian. Does anyone want to share? If not, again, totally okay. Okay. So
I just have a quick thought.
Yeah.
There may be some philosophical assumptions involved in the question, what do the best college teachers do? That need to be recognized, and depending on how you answer those, you might have different answers to who are the best teachers. So you can have a real understanding of your subject, but if you don't communicate that clearly to your teachers, you're probably not going to be the best teacher, and most people would recognize that. So communication skills
100%
would obviously be important, I think, for everybody. But beyond that, there could be some assumptions as to what constitutes best teaching. So for some people, they may have a philosophical assumption that it specifically involves the students, so that the students have opportunity to directly react to what the teacher's saying in class.
Right.
And that might be a bit of a philosophical assumption. Some people might say you shouldn't be lecturing your students, and that may be a philosophical assumption, minimizing lecturing, but I'll leave it at that and get anybody's reaction or your thoughts, Noah.
Does anyone want to respond? I definitely have a thought on it, but I think it's a really important point. Anyone else?
I just have one thought, I guess, to dovetail with what John was saying, and that was with another professor that I worked with. And I had the opportunity to do this with the same class with two different professors with very different approaches. And with one, I guess what made me think about this is when he mentioned how, students might just sort of, repeat what they're being lectured to or about. And then the other professor who would sort of give the same kind of content, but what I noticed was that her approach was just more student focused versus I'm the master
Yeah,
of
and
this,
that,
I'm the master of this content, and you will do this, and this is the way you will do it. And, you know, if you don't do it this way, I'm going to smack your hands. In contrast to someone who still offered that same content or expertise, but allowed a little more flexibility in terms of how students were able to express it or show it in their what they've learned in their assignments. And the end result was that for the students, although I think some of the students in the second professor's approach, their work was less polished, but it was more authentic to what their ideas, you know, what their thoughts were, or how they, I don't know how to put it, but it was just more authentic to their thinking versus sort of regurgitating something that looked perfect,
right.
but, you know, was not so much their
Yeah.
own work that they created. If that
So I
makes
think
sense.
that's a perfect way to kind of launch this, because it's an important point on both parts. And Adrian, this is going to be a theme within this book, at least, that in terms of, it is going a lot, and an important point we'll get to is how he defined excellence. And part of it, calling it the best college teachers, it is not necessarily the best college teachers. He just found really good college teachers according to a specific definition that we'll go over. But a theme in it is creating these lifelong learners and finding their intrinsic motivation in the class, and not creating some polished thing, because that's not really the point of it, especially a 101 class, for example. So I'm going to launch right into it. And exactly to your point, defining what was meant by excellence. So how Ken Bain, the author, kind of phrased it is, all the teachers achieve remarkable success in helping their students learn in ways that made a sustained, substantial, and positive influence on how those students think, feel, and act. And then once identified, he conducted in-depth interviews, qualitative interviews with them. And they also observed the classes taking place. So that is to say, they identified several teachers, and I'll go into a bit more detail on how that occurred. But then once they were identified, and they kind of sat in the class, kind of saw what was going on, and also just talked to them. And then you have researchers kind of, when they ask questions, identifying common themes that come up. And how the book is kind of broken up into, it kind of starts off about before heading into a class. So your assumptions about students, how do you prepare to create a course? And then the second half is more actual conducting of class. So what do they see that commonly came up? So in terms of operationalizing excellence, so how they defined it, basically they were big on students, I guess, ideas about the professor. So when I ask you about a professor looking back, what sort of impact did they have on you? That doesn't mean you had to love them. That wasn't what they were looking for. It was more, when I look back on this class, this kind of changed my life in some way, or it had me think about a topic in a different way. And after that class, I kind of was interested in that topic in some way that I wasn't before. And also they took observations of the class, so they got a sense of that. And also student performance, not just in terms of grades, but investment and caring about the class. So a lot of this is based off the student perspective. So that's important just to know when we're talking about what the best college teachers do. It is based off the aftermath, you know, when the student's kind of perspective on it. So I'm just, basically what I'm going to do is, again, I really like this book. It's been really helpful for me, especially when I started teaching a bit, about just identifying key points to focus on. And I'm just going to go through each chapter and kind of give you the main points that's talked about. And at any point, please feel free to use chat or hop on and talk about any of that. This is open for that. So I think this is definitely one of the more interesting chapters to me. I think so. The chapter is, what do the best teachers know about how we learn? And I think what a lot of the assumption is that there's a transmission model in education. So what we end up doing is we assume, well, if I talk about this, that I'll transmit knowledge to the student. And essentially what they found in their interviews was that the best college teachers, I use quotes, but really good college teachers had this similar kind of approach to students, which was, okay, I know students will come into my class with their own ideas about the topic. So they have these mental models. And if I want true learning to occur, well, what's going to have to happen is I need to change these mental models, and it's going to be a slow process. So how do I do it? I'm going to have to poke holes in those mental models through questions and activities. And activities should kind of foster more questions. And once you are at that point, that you've kind of started to create kind of holes in their mental models or their assumptions about the topic, well, you assume that you've also fostered your students to care about the topic. And the benefit of that was essentially that sometimes students will just, okay, I have holes in a mental model and I don't care. So then the learning stops. And what was special about these teachers, at least, was that they poked holes in the mental models or the assumptions about the course. And even after the class, the students cared enough to kind of keep pursuing it and to keep kind of learning more about it, because throughout the course, the teachers have kind of managed to foster some sort of intrinsic motivation within the student. So as a general kind of framework of kind of how they're approaching the class or how they're approaching learning, it is this kind of model that there's our schemas, our mental schemas about something. We attack it through questions and activities. And then if we want learning to continue afterwards, that we're really gonna have to foster intrinsic motivation within the course. Is there any comments about that? Is that kind of a clear kind of theme? Okay. So I think just for me, at least, going into teaching, I knew people had their own ideas, but it never occurred to me to kind of attack or get to people's mental models right off the bat. So a theme you saw across these teachers was that the beginning of their course would be really identifying what students thought about the topic and trying to get a better idea about what mental models students are taking into the course when they come in. And then from there, so when we talk about a student-focused approach, this is part of that because they are starting where the student is and adjusting accordingly. And then, so in terms of how do teachers prepare to teach, the best way I can kind of summarize this is that it is I don't know if people are familiar with backwards design, but backwards design is essentially this concept of, rather than starting with, usually people say, I have a textbook, I need to teach chapter 1, 2, 3. Backwards design instead focuses on what skills do I want to cultivate, and then working from there. So in essence, this is all about backwards design and focusing on where you want your students to end up at the end of your course, and figuring out the best way to do that. So more specifically, I have 5 billion questions you may want to look at, and there's no necessary right answer here, but some common questions that came up when interviewing these teachers were, what should my students be able to do intellectually, physically, or emotionally as a result of their learning? So when you look at your class, what do you want to build? I mean, it's also kind of an emotional capacity, which was interesting to read about. It's not just intellect necessarily. It's it's a holistic approach to education. Um, how can I best help and encourage them to develop those abilities and the habits of the heart and mind? How can my students and I best understand the nature, quality, and progress of their learning? So how do you know you're doing a good job or getting close to that achievement? And again, that's a theme that came up a lot, and that I'll get to that in a bit. But the teachers were always checking if they were doing a good job about getting to where they want to be. Um, and how can I evaluate my own efforts to foster that learning? Additional kind of questions to consider. I think, especially in terms of the intrinsic motivation part, what big questions is your class helping to answer? Because just from the student perspective, when you put yourself in your student's shoes, I think one of the best things you can do from an intrinsic motivation part is saying, everyday life, what can my class help foster? And that should be really helpful in your actual course design. And then you just kind of go, what do they need to know to get these answers? What preconceived notions? So we go back to the mental models. What preconceived notions may they have that kind of either assist or hurt them reaching that outcome? And what do they know? What do they expect to know? And how will I kind of fill that in between? How will I assess them before a big assignment? So before I have my final, how am I building them up to be ready for that? Transparency, etc. Obviously you don't have to use all of these questions, but this will be up on the website and probably right after. I think just looking through these questions kind of helps you fill in a lot of the holes in your class and think about how to create a course that is student centric and helps students in a legitimate way. So what do they expect of their students? And I don't know, I mean, this was a somewhat iffy chapter for me. Not that I just don't know how pragmatic it is, but I think so for PFF at least. I say not pragmatic because this seems like a long process. So for PFF at least, we focus a lot on reflexivity, being reflective about what assumptions you're bringing into the classroom. And this isn't going to be you're not going to do this over the course of a day or a week or even 2 weeks. This is a kind of lifelong process, but it is really interesting that they found some common themes across these kind of best teachers. And the themes they were very in line with what Adrian was saying before, that they have high expectations of their students, but it is based off authentic goals. So that is very different from having high expectations of your students and filling it in with a lot of work and saying you can do this. What the theme was that I think my students can do whatever I give them, but it is also up to me to kind of foster goals for them that is actually useful to them in some way. And that if I can kind of create those goals well enough, that each student will kind of bring something unique to solving those issues. So what you constantly saw was that they just think their students can do it. And when their students were not succeeding, they had some part in that final result. And another thing was that so I think I saw relatable as a constant theme in the poll everywhere. And there was a rejection of hierarchy in the classroom. So rather than viewing yourself as a teacher and like knowing more than your students, you were kind of just another human being that was there to be helpful. And that is obviously very helpful in kind of being relatable and kind of achieving and creating authentic goals. Oh, Mitch, Iffy was just a side note for me to kind of remind me, don't worry about Iffy. It doesn't stand for anything. It's a side note, really. So I think kind of the main takeaway from the expectation is before you head into a class, what do you expect your students to come out of your class with? What are your assumptions about student behavior? So when you create policies, if you create a late policy that's really punitive, the assumption there might be that students are slackers and they're trying to take advantage of you. Just make sure your policies are very tied to your assumptions about students, and critically look at your assumptions about students. Do they fit with who you want to be? Because we can inherit a lot of policies and ideas about students that may not be true to who we are. Yeah. Okay, so when we switch to the actual how they conduct class, so again, that first half is just kind of building off this idea. Before we even head into a class, what assumptions do we have about students? And how do I build a class? In terms of the actual conducting of the class, so again, the researchers were sitting in on the class and talking to professors about this. And they found some themes here. So the big idea is they created a natural learning environment, which is kind of vague, but what that meant was that the class kind of made itself available for questions. It's also led by questions. So what are you trying to answer with this one course? And again, that goes to backwards design a bit. So like every time you have a class, what is kind of the goal of that? What question are you trying to answer by talking about this? And oftentimes those questions were philosophical in nature, which would, I assume, enhance one's kind of intrinsic motivation in kind of being part of that. Also, there's a lot of, so if you look at like Fink's taxonomy and Bloom's taxonomy, kind of breaks down these different ways of learning. So what you would often see is the class itself would ask students to engage in higher end intellectual activity. So comparing, applying, analyzing, as opposed to memorization. So there would be activities that were provided, and it was a lot of utilizing these skills. And that, again, that would be to help kind of rebuild their mental models about the topic. And they often saw students themselves raise intriguing questions by the end of the class. So they started off with a question, but as the class kind of progressed, students themselves were bringing up questions as well, which would, then lead to more questions. It was almost question after question after question. A really important point, and I think, again, this is just a theme in the book, that they started with the students rather than the discipline. So what do the students want to know about this topic? And how can I meet their needs? So at every turn, it was, I'm focusing on my student and building from there. And I have where I want to go, but if I want to get to that destination, I need to meet students where they are rather than where you want them to be. And I just want to acknowledge that a lot of this book is, if you're looking for like, don't lecture or something like that, you will not find that in this book, because that's not what this book is about. It's about themes that you can achieve in a variety of ways, and it's about an attitude towards students. And I'm quickly looking at chat. So John, so John said, what about values professors bring to class? How should they communicate them to class? mental models. There are different models one can have on the subject, even top scholars with different perspectives. It's a great point. I think we're all going to bring different values to class. And I think I've done a webinar on kind of values and implementing that in a class setting. I think we often don't explicitly kind of make our values clear. And we inherit values within the educational system. So a lot of the values in our educational system revolve around obedience and achievement. Is that the teacher you want to be? What you see amongst this population, at least, it is a lot more focused on benevolence and equality. And it is more student-centric than hierarchical. So if you are looking at values, I would just say be very explicit on what your values are, and those should be implemented in your policies and in your design. And I'm not sure we often explicitly think about that all the time. But thank you for the comment.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so, there are different theoretical perspectives at a university, and sometimes professors are actually trying to convert their students. I mean, this goes on in politics all the time, right? So, and a lot of specific academic questions can be very debatable, meaning there's different points of view. And so, one, I think you're bringing out the point that you should disclose where you're coming from. But this is kind of like, should you be trying to convert your students, in a sense, to a particular point of view that you hold to?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, that's a question in relation to the topic of what do best teachers do.
So, I mean, personally, I don't think it is our job to tell anyone how to think. We all come into the classroom with our own perspectives, and certainly I do as well. And it is our job to be very explicit about what is factual and what is opinion. And part of that, it takes kind of self-work to realize what that distinction, because it isn't always clear. I think students will respect you if you're explicit about what you're saying and what is truth and what is not and what is bias and what isn't. There's a variety of ways to be successful in that area. I just think in general, transparency is the best method, but that is certainly my opinion again. So I don't know if there's a right answer to that, but if anyone else has an opinion on that, please feel free to jump in.
I would say that one of the things that I observed in one of the classes that I was talking about is that it would have really been easy for the approach to have been one where it was all about indoctrination, into a particular political or philosophical point of view. But the other thing that I admired about this is that one, questions would be raised, and then there was a lot of comparison, so that students, it was more about getting students to think critically and to then present their, in the context of the course, to be able to present perhaps a different point of view or just whatever their perspective was. And then teaching them to how to also have some sort of evidence or something other than emotion to make a point. Mm-hmm. because it was actually more about, from what I gathered, really, is that I think they learned more about how to be analytical, how to be critical thinkers, and then come up with a conclusion versus here's some information and this is the conclusion you should make about it.
Yeah.
So I think that's one way in which a teacher can show, use their, or demonstrate, not even demonstrate their values. I think if your goal is to indoctrinate versus to really teach, or just to present information, then that's I guess that's something that some people will do. But if we're talking about what the best teachers do, then I think that the best teachers really present information and then give you or teach you the skills to be able to critically analyze and ask yourself what your assumptions are and what the assumptions may have been from the perspective of whatever has been presented, and then come up with a conclusion that you can then take it forward and share that information with other persons, or in a paper, or however you choose to do that in terms of disseminating information, and do it in a way that is within a sort of an evidence-based or a scholarly perspective versus just being emotional about an issue.
Right. Really well said. And Mitch said something similar about learning how to think critically. And that, I think, is probably more our goal than, well, it's definitely more our goal than telling students how to think, but rather how to view both sides and create decide for your own. So thank you for the comments and thank you for the questions. So other things you saw, and I thought this was interesting. So they constantly seek commitments from students. So what that means is they want to create the class to be co-creative. So they kind of often they would come up with policies together or the goals together. And by doing that, you saw students were more committed to actually achieving the learning objectives of the course. Additional things you saw, this is more kind of specific to whatever you're teaching, but think about what students would need to learn outside of the classroom. So like when I teach research methods, well, if they want to keep thinking about these topics outside of class, well, they need to learn how to actually read research papers. So these teachers were building students for even after the class rather than just kind of soaking up material in it. And those were skills that were constantly practiced. Additionally, engaging students in disciplinary thinking. So put yourselves in, I guess, your own shoes. Well, if I'm a researcher, how do I think about topics, evidence, things like that, research? Where's this research coming from? A skill in teaching, for sure, is communication and making explicit what may be kind of implicit to you. So these teachers were giving step-by-step explicit directions on how people in their field think about topics. And that was definitely something interesting to hear. And then in turn, I guess more specific, so it is not the case that lecture versus active learn. This book was never about that. But what the author did find was that the best kind of teachers were constantly giving diverse learning experiences. So they weren't sticking to one method throughout the course. So you would engage in a variety of methods, and that would kind of help keep students on edge and be more interested in the topic as they went on. How do they treat their students? Again, this is a theme that was mentioned before, but a deep trust in their students, and they believe their students can succeed. So this goes back to your assumptions about your students. They'll, whether we know it or not, it's going to make a difference in the course. I mean, when I've gone on, I talk about this a lot, but when I first started kind of teaching a little, I went on message boards about teaching, and I was a bit shocked at how many teachers seem to dislike their students. And even though they may view a message board as a way to vent about their students, I think a theme from this book is those assumptions and those feelings you have about your students will end up coming out to your students in one way or the other, if you want them to or not. So it is important to examine your assumptions about your students, and the best teachers kind of recognize the value of each of their students and trusted their students deeply. Again, in terms of treating their students, there's a lack of hierarchy in the classroom. So they kind of viewed themselves as fellow students, and they kind of shared their own failures with their students to make them feel kind of less, to not put their teachers on a pedestal. And the classes were kind of co-creative and collaborative. So oftentimes what the author saw was that students would teach one another, and that the students themselves would bring their own questions to the class. And then some classes would kind of revolve around the students' questions as well. So they felt part of the process. Another theme that was very kind of salient within this book is that this goes back to backwards design a bit. So the exams they created are not to check memory or check this foundation. It is directly tied to whatever they kind of want to ultimately build in their course. So there's a real intent behind it. Student evaluations were really common amongst these teachers. So every 4 weeks or so, they would check in with their students and provide kind of, I guess what we would do is a mid-semester feedback, but it was much more frequent amongst this population. And poor student ratings were viewed to be problematic, even though there's a variety of outside factors that may relate to that. So like expected grade, that definitely relates to it. But it suggested to them that their students weren't properly engaged in the course, and they felt partially responsible for that. And also, lenient grading doesn't necessarily mean learning isn't taking place. So the amount of work varied amongst these teachers, but it wasn't uncommon to see some of these best teachers have not that much work for their students, but a lot of learning would occur within the course. So, and how they kind of measured that was the type of questions student would ask in class, the work they produced. And that's just to say there's a variety of different ways to achieve student learning outcomes. It doesn't necessarily mean to get these outcomes, you have to pile on loads of work to your students. So those were all the kind of the chapters in the book. And I think one quote that I really liked that kind of captured the essence of this book, I think, was this idea that I cannot stress enough the simply a powerful notion that the key to, hold on, my face is blocking this. That the powerful notion that the key to understanding the best teaching can be found not in particular practices, but in attitudes of the teachers and their faith in their students' abilities to achieve, and their willingness to take their students seriously and to let them assume control of their own education, and in their commitment to let all policies and practices flow from the central learning objectives and mutual respect and agreement between students and teachers. I think that's really well said. So within that, kind of great outcomes came to be, but a lot of it is what you bring to class and your ability to be agile with your students. So that is just some kind of big picture takeaways. So great teaching, just my opinion and kind of what I took away from the book. Great teaching requires us to get rid of the transmission model of teaching and create an environment where students can engage in deep thinking. Take time to look at your own conceptions of teaching. What do I mean by learning? How can I foster it? How can we recognize its progress? And how can I know if my efforts have hurt or helped my own students? Teaching well can be achieved in a variety of ways, but it is really important your attitude and ideas about your students in terms of achieving that outcome. And a takeaway that he kind of mentioned that was pretty interesting was that just as PhD students, we don't really learn how to teach well. And he thought this has a detrimental effect on the education system. And it may be something to reconsider and to focus more deeply in our work, which leads us to PFF. We are open for email, our website. We have a Twitter account, Instagram, Facebook. Please feel free to contact us. We can help to develop lesson plans, all of that, teaching diversity statements, teaching philosophy statements. We are open to help in any way we can. And there is a webinar on the 19th, I believe, so 9 days, which is understanding teaching and learning as a complex process. So please feel free to sign up for that. So that is all I have, but if anyone wants to sit around and chat, I will be here for a while. So thank you for stopping by.